The Soviet invasion of Manchuria began on August 9, 1945, with the Soviet invasion of the Japanese puppet state of Manchukuo. It was the largest campaign of the Soviet-Japanese War of 1945, which resumed hostilities between the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics and the Empire of Japan after nearly 6 years of peace since 1939. The operation has sometimes been called Operation August Storm. The Russo-Japanese War of the early 20th century resulted in a Japanese victory and the Treaty of Portsmouth, by which, along with other subsequent events, including the Mukden Incident and the Japanese invasion of Manchuria in September 1931, Japan eventually gained control of Korea, Manchuria, and southern Sakhalin. In the late 1930s, there were a series of border incidents between the Soviet Union and Japan, the most significant being the Battle of Lake Khasan, the Changkufeng Incident, July-August 1938, and the Battle of Khalkhin Gol, the Nomonhan Incident, May-September 1939, which led to the Soviet-Japanese Neutrality Pact of April 1941. The pact freed forces from the border incidents and allowed the Soviets to concentrate on their war against Germany and the Japanese, to focus on their expansion southward in Asia and the Pacific Ocean. With success at Stalingrad and the imminent defeat of Germany, the Soviet attitude toward Japan changed both publicly, with Stalin delivering speeches denouncing Japan, and secretly with the buildup of forces and supplies in the Far East. At the Tehran Conference in November 1943, Stalin, Winston Churchill, and Franklin Roosevelt agreed that the Soviet Union would enter the war against Japan once Germany was defeated. Stalin faced a dilemma. He wanted to avoid a two-front war at all costs, but he also saw an opportunity to secure gains in the Far East, beyond those he expected in Europe. The only way Stalin could secure those gains without a two-front war was for Germany to capitulate before Japan. Because of the Soviet-Japanese Neutrality Pact, the Soviets adopted the policy of interning Allied air crews that landed in Soviet territory after operations against Japan. Although aviators detained in the Soviet Union under these circumstances were generally allowed to escape after a certain period of time, nevertheless, the Soviet buildup in the Far East accelerated steadily, even before the defeat of Germany in early 1945. It became evident to the Japanese that the Soviets were preparing to invade Manchuria, although they correctly calculated that they would probably not attack before the defeat of Germany. In addition to their problems in the Pacific, the Japanese understood the need to determine when and where a Soviet invasion would take place. At the Yalta Conference in February 1945, Stalin obtained Roosevelt's acceptance of Soviet expansion in the Far East, in exchange for agreeing to enter the Pacific War within 2 or 3 months. After the defeat of Germany in mid-March, things were not going well in the Pacific for the Japanese, and they had withdrawn their elite troops from Manchuria to support actions in the Pacific. Meanwhile, the Soviets continued their preparations in the Far East, having decided that they did not wish to renew the Neutrality Pact. The terms of the pact required a 12-month notice of expiration, so on April 5, 1945, the Soviets apparently complied, informing the Japanese that they did not wish to renew the treaty. This caused great concern among the Japanese, but the Soviets made great efforts to assure them that the treaty would still be in force for 12 more months, and that they had nothing to worry about. Germany surrendered shortly after midnight Moscow time on May 9, 1945, which meant that if the Soviets were to honor the Yalta Agreement, they would have to enter the war against Japan before August 9th. The situation continued to deteriorate. For the Japanese, Now the only remaining Axis power in the war, they were anxious to maintain peace with the Soviets and ultimately achieve an end to the war. Since Yalta, they had repeatedly tried to convince the Soviets to extend the Neutrality Pact, as well as attempting to involve them in peace negotiations with the Western Allies. The Soviets did nothing to discourage these approaches. Instead, they were happy to prolong the process as long as possible while continuing to prepare their invasion forces. One of the objectives of the cabinet of Admiral Baron Suzuki upon taking office in April was to try to secure any peace terms other than unconditional surrender. In late June, they again approached the Soviets, inviting them to mediate with the Western Allies in support of Japan, providing them with specific proposals. In exchange, they were willing to offer the Soviets very attractive territorial concessions. Stalin ostensibly showed interest, and the Japanese now awaited an official response from the Soviets, even as the latter continued to avoid providing one. The Potsdam Conference was held from July 16th to August 6th. On July 24th, the Soviet Union withdrew all its embassy staff and their families from Japan. On July 26th, the conference produced the Potsdam Declaration, by which Churchill, Harry S. Truman, and Chiang Kai-shek demanded the unconditional surrender of Japan. The Japanese avoided responding to the declaration, continuing to wait for a clarifying response from the Soviets. The Japanese had been monitoring Trans-Siberian railway traffic and Soviet activity east of Manchuria, together with dilatory tactics. This suggested that the Soviets would not be ready to invade eastern Manchuria before late August. The Japanese had no concrete evidence as to when or where an invasion would occur. They had estimated that an attack was unlikely before the spring of 1946, but the Stavka had in fact planned an offensive for mid-August, successfully concealing the buildup of a force of 90 divisions. Many Soviet units had crossed Siberia in their own vehicles so as not to overload the rail line. The Japanese were completely taken by surprise when they received the Soviet declaration of war 1 hour before midnight on August 8th, now facing a simultaneous invasion on 3 fronts that began just after midnight on August 9th. The Imperial Japanese Navy did not contribute to the defense of Manchuria, whose occupation it had always opposed for strategic reasons. In addition, at the time of the Soviet invasion, the few remnants of its fleet were stationed and tasked with defending the Japanese islands in case of an invasion by US forces, compounding their problems. The Japanese army made many major miscalculations and errors, the most significant being that they erroneously assumed any attack from the west would follow the old railway line toward Hailar, or move towards Solon from the eastern tip of Mongolia. The Soviets did indeed attack along those routes, but the main attack from the west crossed the supposedly impassable Greater Khingan mountain range south of Solon and penetrated into central Manchuria. Japanese military intelligence failed to determine the nature, location, and scale of the Soviet buildup in the Soviet Far East. Based on an initial underestimation of Soviet strength and monitoring of Soviet railway traffic on the Trans-Siberian line, the Japanese believed that the Soviets would not have sufficient forces for an offensive before late August 1945, and that an attack would be more likely in the autumn of 1945 or the spring of 1946, due to the withdrawal of elite units of the Kwantung Army to be deployed in the Pacific Theater. The Japanese developed new operational plans during the summer of 1945 for the defense of Manchuria against an apparently inevitable Soviet attack. This required the redeployment of most available forces from the border areas. The borders would be lightly defended and delaying actions would be conducted, while the main force was to resist strongly in the southeastern corner, thus defending Korea from attack. In addition, the Japanese had only observed Soviet activity on the Trans-Siberian Railway line and along the eastern Manchurian front. Therefore, they prepared for an invasion from the east, believing that when an attack came from the west, the redeployed forces would be able to handle the situation. Although the Japanese redeployment in Manchukuo had begun, it was not expected to be completed until September 1945. Therefore, the Kwantung Army was in the middle of redeployment when the Soviets launched their simultaneous attack on 3 fronts. Before moving on to the next topic, do not forget to leave your like on the video if you are enjoying the content. The operation was carried out as a classic double envelopment in an area the size of the entire Western European theatre of World War II. In the western pincer, the Red Army advanced through the deserts and mountains of Mongolia, far from its supply rail lines. This confused Japanese military analysis of Soviet logistics, and the defenders were taken by surprise in unfortified positions. The commanders of the Kwantung Army were participating in a planning exercise at the time of the invasion and were far from their forces during the first 18 hours of the conflict. The Russians treated the Japanese with extreme cruelty. After their deadly attack on the Kwantung Army in Manchuria, only days before the surrender of Japan, Japanese forces were overrun by Soviet attacks behind the lines. Soviet paratroopers destroyed the Kwantung Army, while Japanese anti-tank shells bounced off the sides of Soviet tanks. Japanese forces in Manchuria retreated in fear. Japanese troops and men fit for service in Manchuria were taken prisoner by the Russians and transported to labor camps in Siberia, where many Japanese died. From the Russian point of view, this was seen as revenge for Russia's defeat in the Russo-Japanese War of 1905. Stories of Russian mistreatment of Japanese reached Beijing through Japanese evacuees from Manchuria, generating panic among the Japanese population. However, the Russians honored their agreement with Chiang Kai-shek not to enter China proper. Japanese communications infrastructure was poor, and the Japanese lost communication with forward units very early. Nevertheless, the Kwantung Army had a formidable reputation as fierce and relentless fighters, and although understrength and poorly prepared, they offered strong resistance in the city of Hailar, which tied down some Soviet forces. The Japanese defenders held out until August 18th, when 3,827 survivors surrendered. At the same time, Soviet airborne units captured airfields and urban centers ahead of the ground forces, and aircraft transported fuel to those units that had outrun their supply lines. Because Japanese 37mm and 47mm anti-tank guns were suitable only for fighting light Soviet tanks, Japanese forces decided to use suicide bomber squads strapped with grenades and explosives as their primary improvised anti-tank weapon. There are reports that the Japanese Army Air Force was using kamikaze aircraft in attempts to stop the Soviet advance. However, the prospect of a rapid defeat for the Japanese army still seemed far from clear. Given the fanatical and sometimes suicidal resistance presented by Japanese forces, similar to the Battle of Okinawa between April and June 1945, there was every reason to believe that a long and difficult campaign would be required to capture the remaining Japanese fortified areas in some parts of the Soviet advance. These expectations were fulfilled after a week of fighting during which Soviet forces had penetrated deeply into Manchukuo. Emperor Hirohito of Japan recorded the Gyokuon Hoso, which was broadcast by radio to the Japanese nation on August 15, 1945. It did not make direct reference to Japan's surrender, instead declaring that the government had been instructed to fully accept the terms of the Potsdam Declaration. This created confusion in the minds of many listeners who were unsure whether Japan had surrendered. The poor audio quality of the radio broadcast, as well as the formal and polite language in which the speech was composed, worsened the confusion. Imperial Japanese Army headquarters did not immediately communicate the ceasefire order to the Kwantung Army, and many elements of the army either did not understand it or ignored it. Therefore, pockets of strong resistance by the Kwantung Army continued, and the Soviets continued their advance, largely bypassing resistance pockets and reaching Mukden. By August 20th, the ceasefire order was eventually communicated to the Kwantung Army, but not before the Soviets had made most of their territorial advances. On August 18th, several Soviet amphibious landings were carried out ahead of the land advance. 3 landings in northern Korea, 1 landing in southern Sakhalin, and 1 landing in the Kuril Islands. This meant that at least in Korea, there were already Soviet soldiers waiting for the troops arriving by land in southern Sakhalin and the Kurils. This resulted in a sudden establishment of Soviet sovereignty. The land advance was halted some distance short of the Yalu River, the beginning of the Korean peninsula, when aerial supply also became inaccessible. Forces already present in Korea were able to establish control in the northern part of the peninsula in accordance with agreements previously made with the US government to divide the Korean peninsula. Soviet forces stopped at the 38th parallel, leaving the Japanese still in control of the southern part of the peninsula. Later, on September 8, 1945, US forces landed at Incheon. The invasion of Manchuria was a factor that contributed to Japan's surrender and the end of World War II. In addition, the Soviet occupation of Manchuria, together with portions of the northern Korean peninsula, allowed those regions to be transferred by the Soviet Union to the control of local communists. Control of these regions by communist governments supported by Soviet authorities would be a factor in the rise of Chinese communists and would shape the political conflict of the Korean War. Several thousand Japanese who had been sent as settlers to Manchuria and Inner Mongolia were abandoned in China. Most of the Japanese left behind in China were women, and these Japanese women mostly married Chinese men and became known as war wives. Abandoned Zanru Fujin for having children fathered by Chinese men. Japanese women could not bring their Chinese families back to Japan, so most remained. Japanese law allowed only children fathered by Japanese fathers to become Japanese citizens. By the end of 1949, numerous members of the former Kwantung Army who had been captured during the Soviet invasion of Manchuria were convicted for their connection with the activities of Unit 731 and related units for their links to crimes against humanity and the use of chemical and biological weapons. During the invasion of Manchuria, Soviet soldiers caused damage and suffering to Japanese civilians. A tragic example was the incident at Gegenmiao, where Soviet soldiers from an armored unit brutally attacked a group of Japanese women and children, resulting in a large number of casualties. In addition, Japanese belongings were looted by Soviet troops. These forces that committed such actions were also involved in similar acts against civilians in East Prussia. According to Soviet historian Vyacheslav Zimonin, many Japanese settlers faced desperate situations when encountering the Red Army, leading to mass tragedies. Some mothers were coerced by Japanese forces into taking extreme measures, resulting in terrible acts against their own children before injuring themselves or being injured. The Japanese army, regrettably, was also involved in similar incidents of violence against its own citizens. The commander of the Japanese Fifth Army, General Shimizu, expressed an insensitive stance by declaring that every nation lives and dies by its own laws. Wounded Japanese soldiers were frequently abandoned to their cruel fate when their units retreated. British and American reports highlighted the conduct of Soviet troops who, during the occupation of Manchuria, terrorized and looted the local population in Mukden, ignoring appeals from local authorities regarding acts of violence in Harbin. Soviet forces appeared indifferent to protests from leaders of the Chinese Communist Party regarding widespread assaults and looting. There were incidents in which Chinese authorities in Manchuria confronted and detained Soviet soldiers for various crimes, resulting in tensions between the two factions. During the Soviet occupation of North Korea, there were reports of sexual abuses perpetrated by Soviet soldiers against Japanese and Korean women in the northern half of the Korean peninsula. The Soviets took possession of Japanese companies in Manchuria and northern Korea, taking with them valuable materials and industrial equipment. Japanese women in Manchukuo were frequent victims of sexual violence by Russian soldiers, including young girls from Japanese families who worked for the army and for the Manchukuo Railway at Bayon Airport, as well as Japanese military nurses. Reports confirmed that Russian soldiers captured Japanese civilian girls at Bayon Airport, where there were about 1,000 Japanese civilians committing acts of violence regularly. In addition, they repeatedly assaulted 75 Japanese nurses at the Sungu military hospital in Manchukuo during the occupation. Ignoring all appeals from Japanese authorities to stop the abuses, the Japanese were forced to hand over their women as war booty, as ordered by Soviet soldiers. Soviet soldiers committed sexual assaults against Japanese women belonging to a group of Japanese families led by a woman named Tami, who attempted to flee their settlements on August 14th toward Mudanjiang. It is important to recognize that on all sides of World War II, there were abuses by soldiers. Here on the channel, we have several videos that show those atrocities, both from the Axis and the Allies. If you feel this video brought you value in any way, please subscribe to the channel. Fasvim series. See you soon.